Ricardo Alejandro prided himself on his eyes. He could see a lie before it was spoken. At 60, he was a legend of the underworld, not for his violence, but for his foresight. To him, the world was a chessboard, and Jordan, the maid's son, was a pawn. Ricardo left the briefcase open, $100,000 in crisp bills, and closed his eyes, intending to test the boy's integrity. He wanted to prove that everyone, even a child, had a price. But the silence of the mansion was too perfect. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him, and for the first time in a decade, Ricardo didn't just pretend to sleep. He drifted into a dark, dreamless void. When he snapped awake an hour later, the library was empty. The briefcase was gone. The boy was gone. In that moment, the sophisticated boss felt something he hadn't felt in years: genuine shock. This wasn't just a theft, it was a challenge to his dignity. He didn't call for guns, he called for his car. The hunt for the little thief began, not with a roar, but with a cold, calculated drive into the rain. Ricardo Alejandro had not raised his voice in 11 years. Not when a lieutenant in Newark had skimmed from the quarterly accounts. Not when a rival family out of Philadelphia had tried to claim the port contracts he'd spent 2 decades building. Not even when his personal physician sat across from him in the sunroom of his Connecticut estate and told him, with the careful diplomacy of a man who understood who he was speaking to, that his heart was asking for rest. He had simply nodded, dismissed the man, and poured himself a second cup of coffee. That was the thing people never understood about Ricardo. They expected a man in his position to be loud, to be the kind of creature who smashed things, who made rooms go cold when he entered. Hollywood had given the world that image, and most men in his world were only too happy to perform it. Ricardo found it exhausting. More than that, he found it wasteful. Anger, in his experience, was a currency spent by men who had run out of smarter options. His Connecticut estate sat behind iron gates on 4 acres of manicured land, the kind of property that real estate listings called distinguished, but that the neighbors, old money, all of them, called something quieter behind closed doors. The main house had 14 rooms. Ricardo used perhaps 5 of them with any regularity. The library, the kitchen, the study, his bedroom, where he slept precisely 7 hours, no more, no less, and the long gallery on the east wing, where he walked each morning at 6, hands clasped behind his back, watching the light come over the tree line. Order was not a preference for Ricardo, it was a philosophy. Every surface in the house had its purpose. Every person on his payroll had their role, their hours, their instructions, written, memorized, and never to be improvised upon. The gardener arrived on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The car was serviced on the 1st of every month. The household accounts were reviewed each Sunday evening at the mahogany desk in the study, and the numbers were always expected to be precise. Not close. Precise. He had built that kind of life deliberately, brick by careful brick, over 40 years of work that had begun in a 2-room apartment in the Bronx before expanding outward through a dozen cities, 100 arrangements, on a network of interests that stretched from the garment district of Manhattan down through the shipping corridors of Baltimore and into the quiet money of New England. By 60, Ricardo did not need to be everywhere. He simply needed people to know that he could be, if he chose. His suits were bespoke, cut by a tailor in Midtown who had been dressing him for 23 years. Dark pinstripe, always. The fabric had a subtle sheen in the right light. It was like something that knew its own value without announcing it. His silver hair was combed back with the same precision every morning, and his hands, broad, tattooed with the faint remnants of a younger, less patient life, were always immaculately clean. The tattoos were the only visible contradiction, the only remaining evidence that Ricardo Alejandro had not always been this still. He governed his household the way he governed everything else, from a slight remove, with total awareness. He noticed when the floral arrangement in the entrance hall was one day past fresh. He noticed when a door was left 2 inches more open than it should have been. He noticed the sounds of his estate, the way a ship's captain notices the sounds of an engine, not consciously, but immediately, and with a precision that registered the smallest deviation from the expected. Which was why he noticed Dorcas. She had worked for him for 3 years, arriving each morning from her apartment in Bridgeport, quiet as water, efficient as a good clock. She cleaned and organized with a thoroughness that Ricardo respected, and she asked for nothing beyond her salary and her Saturdays. He had no complaints about her. He rarely thought about her at all, except in the abstract way that a man thinks about a well-functioning piece of machinery. But lately, something in the house had shifted in her presence, a hesitation in her movements, and a redness at the edge of her eyes that she attempted, without success, to conceal. The way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window with a dish in her hand and stared at nothing for a full half-minute before continuing. Ricardo was not a sentimental man, but he was an observant one. He catalogued these changes without comment, the way he catalogued all information, patiently and without immediate action. A thing revealed itself when it was ready. Forcing it open only damaged the contents. What he had not catalogued, because he had not yet thought to, was the boy. The boy she sometimes brought on early dismissal days, when the school in Bridgeport let out before she finished her hours. A quiet child, perhaps 10 years old, who sat at the kitchen table and did his homework while his mother worked. Ricardo had passed him twice in the hallway. He had not looked closely enough. That, as it turned out, would be his first mistake. So Dorcas Zaragoza had become an expert in the architecture of silence, not the comfortable kind, not the silence of a Sunday morning or a room full of sleeping children. The kind she had mastered was load-bearing. It was the silence that held everything up, the silence that, if she ever let it crack, would bring the whole structure of her life down with it. She arrived at the Connecticut estate each morning at 7:45, and stepping off the bus from Bridgeport with her canvas tote over one shoulder and her face arranged into the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned that composed was the only acceptable version of herself in this house. The gravel drive crunched under her flat shoes. The iron gates, always open by the time she arrived, framed the main house in the distance like something from a painting. All dark stone and tall windows, ivy creeping up the east wall with the slow patience of something that had nowhere else to be. She had learned the rhythms of the house, the way you learn a language you were not born into, carefully, by ear, with attention to every nuance. Mr. Alejandro took his coffee at 7, black, no sugar, in the small Limoges cup that sat on the left side of the kitchen shelf. The library was to be dusted, but never rearranged. The books on the lower shelves were reference material. The upper shelves were memory, and the distinction mattered to him in ways he had never explained, and she had never asked about. The hallway on the west side of the house got afternoon light that showed every fingerprint on the wainscoting, so she saved it for last. These were not rules she had been given so much as truths she had discovered, the way you discover the particular creak of a staircase, by paying close enough attention. Attention kept you employed. Employed kept Gilberta alive. Then that was the whole equation, reduced to its simplest form. She did not allow herself to dress it up with more words than it needed. Her husband had been diagnosed 14 months ago at Yale New Haven Hospital by a cardiologist who had the gentle manner of a man accustomed to delivering news that people were not ready for. Congestive heart failure, advanced enough that the word manageable had appeared only once in the conversation, hedged on both sides by language that meant the opposite. The surgery he needed, the kind that might give him years instead of months, cost more than Dorcas made in 4 years of careful saving. The number sat in her chest like a stone she carried everywhere, invisible and constant. She had not told Ricardo. The thought of it, of sitting across from that composed, silver-haired man in his impeccably appointed study, surrounded by his first edition volumes and his Hermès desk accessories, and the faint smell of cedar wood that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, made something in her throat close. He was not cruel. She had never experienced cruelty from him. But there was a quality to his attention, when he turned it fully on a person, that felt like being assessed rather than seen. And Dorcas could not afford to be assessed right now. She could not afford for anyone in this house to look at her too carefully. So she had become invisible in plain sight. She polished the sterling flatware in the dining room with a chamois cloth, her hands moving in slow, practiced circles. The silver caught the morning light from the tall windows and threw it back in fragments. Her phone was in her apron pocket, switched to silent, and every 20 minutes she felt it vibrate against her hip. The hospital's automated reminder system, notifying her of an appointment, a prescription update, a form that still needed her signature. She did not reach for it. Not in this house. The previous Thursday, Gilberta had been admitted overnight, a precautionary measure, they had called it, which was the medical system's way of saying something they were not ready to name. She had sat with him until 2 a.m, in a chair beside his bed in the cardiac ward, holding his hand, while the monitors beeped their patient, but in different rhythm. His breathing had been labored, shallow. He had looked at her with the expression he used when he was trying to protect her from his own fear, and she had looked back at him with the expression she used for exactly the same reason. She had arrived at the estate the next morning at 7:46, 1 minute late. Ricardo had not mentioned it. What she had not noticed, what she could not have noticed, because she had stopped letting herself observe anything beyond the work directly in front of her, was that Jordan had begun to notice everything she was trying to hide. Her son saw what she could not afford to show, and unlike her, he had not yet learned to be still about it. Subscribe now if you haven't. Your support goes a long way. Jordan had been inside the study exactly once before. 3 weeks ago, his mother had sent him to return a letter that had fallen from the desk to the floor of the hallway. A small cream envelope with a wax seal, the kind Jordan had only ever seen in movies. He had knocked twice, heard nothing, pushed the door open 2 inches, placed the envelope on the corner of the nearest shelf, and retreated. The whole thing had taken 11 seconds. He had counted. Today, his mother had sent him to collect the breakfast tray. Mr. Alejandro had not yet returned to the kitchen. A routine errand. A simple one. She had said it without looking up from the linen she was folding, her voice carrying the particular flatness it had taken on lately. The voice she used when she was somewhere else entirely, standing in a hospital corridor in her mind, while her hands went through the motions of the house. Jordan had heard that voice every day for 14 months. He understood it the way children understand things, adults believe they've successfully hidden. Completely, and without being able to say so. He carried himself quietly down the west hallway, past the wainscoting his mother polished every afternoon, past the tall window where the Connecticut light fell across the runner rug in long, pale strips. The house smelled of cedar wood and old paper, and something faintly floral that he'd never been able to identify, something that seemed to belong to the walls themselves, the way certain smells belong to certain places and cannot be separated from them. So the study door was ajar. He nudged it open with his shoulder, the way his mother had shown him. Never a full push, always a slow press, so that if someone was inside, you announced yourself gradually rather than all at once. Good manners, she called it. Ricardo Alejandro called it something else, Jordan suspected, though he had never heard the man explain it. The breakfast tray sat on the low table near the window, untouched. The coffee had gone cold, the single slice of toast, but cut diagonally on the Wedgwood plate, sat uneaten beside it. And in the high-backed leather chair behind the mahogany desk, Ricardo Alejandro was asleep. Jordan stopped. Not from fear, exactly. Something more careful than fear. He stood 3 feet inside the doorway and simply looked, the way you look at something you've been told is dangerous, and find, in the looking, that the danger is real, but not the way you imagined it. The man was still. Deeply still. Not the kind that belongs to genuine sleep rather than performed rest. His silver head had tilted slightly to one side. One hand rested on the arm of the chair. The other lay open in his lap. The tattooed knuckles relaxed. The cigar he'd apparently been holding at some point. Now, cold in the crystal ashtray on the desk beside an open briefcase. Jordan's eyes moved to the briefcase. He would think about this moment for years afterward. The specific quality of the light in that room, and the faint sound of the wind in the tree line beyond the east-facing windows. The way his own heartbeat seemed to slow down rather than accelerate, as though his body understood, before his mind did, that this was a moment requiring absolute steadiness. The briefcase was full of money, stacked, banded, organized with the same precision that governed everything else in this house. He didn't know exactly how much, but he had sat at the kitchen table enough times while his mother whispered into her phone in the next room, and he had learned the number the surgeons needed, the way children learn the things adults are desperate to keep from them. Through walls, through silence, through the specific way his father's face changed every time the subject almost surfaced. He thought about his father's breathing, the sound it made now, at night, when his father didn't know anyone was listening. He thought about his mother at the window, with the dish in her hand, staring at nothing. Jordan crossed the room. He moved with a slowness that was not timidity, but deliberateness, the considered movement of someone who has already made a decision and is now simply carrying it out. He picked up the canvas bag his mother kept behind the kitchen door for grocery runs. He had taken it from the hook on his way here, not knowing why. The way sometimes the body prepares for things the mind hasn't yet admitted it's considering. The money fit. Most of it. He did not look at the man in the chair again, not because he was afraid of what he'd see, but because he already knew. He had seen his father's face in the hospital bed. He had seen his mother's face every morning for 14 months. Whatever consequence waited on the other side of this room's door was something he would carry. His father's heart was worth it. He slipped out into the hallway, and the door settled almost silently behind him, 2 inches open, just as he'd found it. The first thing Ricardo registered was the light. It had moved. The pale stripe of afternoon sun that had been falling across the left side of his desk when he closed his eyes was now stretched long and amber across the floor, reaching nearly to the bookcase on the opposite wall. He had slept for more than an hour, perhaps closer to 2. He did not move immediately, for that was not his way. Instead, he sat with the information for a moment, the stiffness in his neck, the particular quality of the late afternoon quiet, the fact that his cigar had gone completely cold in the ashtray, and let it assemble itself into something he could understand. Then his eyes found the desk. The briefcase was gone. Ricardo sat forward in the chair slowly, the leather releasing a low sound beneath him. He looked at the desktop with the focused attention of a man checking his own perception rather than trusting it. The Mont Blanc pen, the folded newspaper, the crystal ashtray, the rectangular impression in the desk's surface where the briefcase had sat for the past 3 days. Gone. He stood, walked to the desk, pressed 2 fingers to the spot where the case had been, as though confirming through touch what his eyes had already reported. The mahogany was cool and bare and absolute. For a moment he simply stood there, one hand resting on the desk, and the room was very quiet around him. In 40 years of operating in spaces where mistakes carried permanent consequences, Ricardo Alejandro had made very few of them. He could count the serious ones on one hand. He remembered each with the clarity of a man who had never allowed himself the comfort of rewriting the past. Mistakes were data. You examined them, you understood them, and then you did not repeat them. That was the whole of it. This was a mistake, not the briefcase. The briefcase was a problem, not a mistake. The mistake was the sleep. The genuine, unguarded, defenseless sleep in an unlocked room. He had intended to rest his eyes for 20 minutes while the boy was in the room, had intended to watch through the calculated sliver of awareness he'd trained himself to maintain, even in stillness. But his body had taken the decision away from him, and now a man who prided himself on seeing everything had been rendered blind by something as ordinary as exhaustion. He moved to the study door, still ajar, 2 inches, exactly as it had been, which meant whoever had come in and out had been careful, had known enough to leave things precisely as found. The breakfast tray was gone as well. Ricardo stood in the doorway and looked down the west hallway. Empty. The late sun came through the tall window at the far end and cast the runner rug in amber and shadow. From somewhere deeper in the house came the faint sound of water running. Dorcas in the kitchen, working through her afternoon routine with the steady, invisible efficiency he had always credited to her, without examining it too closely. He did not call out to her. Not yet. Instead, he walked to the kitchen entrance and stood at the threshold for a moment, watching, while Dorcas stood at the sink with her back to him, her hands moving through the motions of washing the good crystal, each piece held with the careful reverence his household's finer things seemed to inspire in people who had not grown up around them. The afternoon light caught the glasses as she turned them, throwing small prisms across the white tile. She did not sense him there, or if she did, she gave no indication. "Where is Jordan?" She turned. The expression on her face in that first, on unguarded half-second, told him almost everything. A flash of something complicated, too layered to read quickly, before the mask of composure came down over it. She set the crystal glass in the drying rack with steady hands. "He stepped out, Mr. Alejandro, a short while ago." A breath. "He sometimes walks when the school day was long. I told him not to be far." Ricardo looked at her for a moment, just long enough for her to understand that he was looking. Truly looking, so the way he hadn't bothered to before. How long ago? Not a question. She registered the distinction. "An hour," she said. "Perhaps a little more." He nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the study. He needed his phone and his car, and approximately 30 seconds to make one call to a man in Bridgeport, whose particular value lay in knowing where things went when they disappeared. But halfway down the hall, he stopped. He turned back and looked again at the kitchen doorway. I'm at the drying rack, at the careful, trembling composure of a woman who had just lied to him with the practiced stillness of someone who had been carrying a secret for a very long time. The boy hadn't taken a walk, and Dorcas Zaragoza knew exactly where her son had gone. The car was a black S-Class Mercedes, and it moved through the Connecticut afternoon the way Ricardo moved through most situations, quietly, without hurry, and with the absolute certainty that it would arrive where it intended to go. He sat in the back with his phone in one hand and his other hand resting on his knee, watching the familiar landscape of Fairfield County slide past the tinted window. The trees along Route 1 had begun their early October turn, the maples going copper and amber at the edges, the kind of New England autumn that appeared on calendars and postcards, and meant nothing to Ricardo beyond a change in the angle of the light. And he had never been a man who noticed seasons for their beauty. He noticed them for what they indicated about conditions. Current conditions. A 10-year-old boy was somewhere in Bridgeport with $100,000 in a canvas grocery bag. His first call had gone to a man named Teo, who ran a small logistics office out of a building on Iranistan Avenue, and whose actual function bore no resemblance to anything listed on his business registration. Teo had contacts at 3 of the city's traffic monitoring hubs and an informal relationship with a dispatcher at the Bridgeport Transit Authority. If the boy had taken a bus, Teo would know which line within 20 minutes. His second call had gone to a man named Ruiz, who knew every bodega, corner store, and informal gathering point within a 12-block radius of the Zaragoza family's apartment on Maplewood Avenue. If Jordan had gone home first, or stopped anywhere familiar along the way, so Ruiz would have it. Ricardo did not raise his voice on either call. He stated what he needed, listened to the confirmation, and ended the conversation. Efficiency was a form of respect, in his view, for both parties' time. He had not told Dorcas he was leaving. There had been no scene in the kitchen, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. He had simply looked at her for one long moment, long enough for her to understand the conversation that wasn't being spoken, and then he had gone to retrieve his jacket from the study, the Brioni, charcoal, the one he reached for when he wanted to feel like himself, and walked out through the front entrance to the waiting car. Whatever was happening in that house between a mother and her conscience was not his immediate concern. The boy was the thread he intended to follow. What he expected to find, when he pulled it, was ordinary. Children who took things ran toward pleasure or away from fear. They made for toy stores or gaming shops, or the kinds of fast food restaurants that represented luxury to a kid raised on a careful budget. Sometimes they went to a friend's house and hid the thing under a bed and pretended to themselves that they'd figure out the rest later. The psychology of impulsive theft in a minor was not complicated. Ricardo had seen it enough times, in enough contexts, to feel reasonably confident he understood the pattern. He would find Jordan somewhere predictable. He would retrieve the briefcase. He would make a decision about the rest. Teo called back in 17 minutes. "No bus," he said. "I pulled the corridor cameras on the Route 8 stops between Trumbull and downtown. Nothing matching the description on any departure in the window you gave me. Kid didn't take public transit." Ricardo absorbed this. "Rideshare?" "Checking. But if he's 10 and doesn't have a card, he's walking, or he got a ride from someone he knows." "Stay on it," Ruiz called 4 minutes later with a similar report. No one at the apartment. Neighbors hadn't seen the boy. The woman at the corner grocery on Maplewood, who knew everyone within 6 blocks by name and face, had not seen Jordan that afternoon. Ricardo set the phone on the seat beside him and looked out the window. The car was moving through downtown Bridgeport now, and the neighborhoods shifting from the careful orderliness of the suburbs into something grittier and more honest. Brick facades, nail salons, a West Indian bakery with its door propped open, the smell of something warm and spiced, reaching even through the closed windows of the Mercedes. A group of kids in school uniforms stood at a crosswalk. None of them were Jordan. He ran the logic again. No bus, no rideshare, no familiar stops. The boy was on foot, so which meant he had a destination close enough to reach on foot, or important enough to walk to regardless of the distance. A child with $100,000 did not walk 3 miles in October for a toy. Teo called again. His voice, usually flat, carried something different this time. A hesitation. "Mr. Alejandro, I pulled the cameras on the Pequannock Street corridor toward the hospital district." A pause. "I think you need to see where this kid was headed." Teo sent the footage to Ricardo's phone in 3 separate clips, each one pulled from a different camera along the Pequannock Street corridor in Bridgeport. Ricardo watched them in the back of the Mercedes without expression. The first clip was time-stamped at 2:47 in the afternoon. The camera was positioned above a dry cleaner's awning on the corner of Pequannock and Broad, angled downward at the sidewalk. The image was grainy. the kind of footage that municipal cameras in mid-sized Connecticut cities produced when no one had updated the equipment in several years. But it was clear enough. A boy in a light jacket, carrying a canvas bag held tight against his chest with both arms, moving at a pace just below a run, head down, shoulders forward. The rain had started by then. You could see it in the way the pavement darkened, and in the small distortions at the edge of the frame where drops hit the lens. Jordan moved through it without breaking stride, without looking for an overhang or a doorway. He was already soaked in that first clip, which meant he had been walking in it long before the camera found him. The second clip came from a traffic camera on State Street, approximately a mile and a half further, along the same general trajectory. Timestamp 3:09, 22 minutes later. The boy was still moving. His pace had slowed slightly, not from doubt, Ricardo noted, but from the particular kind of physical depletion that sets in when the body has been pushed past its comfortable range and is now operating on something other than energy. His jacket was dark with water, the canvas bag, visibly heavier looking for the way he was compensating his posture to carry it, was still pressed to his chest. He had not stopped. Not once in a mile and a half of cold October rain had the boy stopped. Ricardo turned the phone face down on the seat beside him and looked out the window for a moment. The Mercedes was moving through the hollow neighborhood now, the streets narrowing, the buildings closer together. He was aware of something shifting in the architecture of his thinking, some quiet rearrangement occurring in the back of his mind, beneath the level where he made deliberate decisions. He did not examine it directly. He let it work. He picked the phone back up and watched the third clip. This one was the longest. A camera at the intersection near St. Raphael's corridor, capturing a wider angle of the street. Timestamp 3:24. Jordan appeared from the left side of the frame, and in this footage, finally, you could see his face. Not clearly. The resolution and the rain between them made that impossible. But enough. Enough to see that the boy's mouth was set in a line that did not belong on the face of a child. The expression of someone who has passed through fear and come out the other side of it into something quieter and more absolute. 3 miles, total, from the estate to the hospital district. A grown man in good shoes would have found that walk unpleasant in this weather. A 10-year-old in a light jacket, carrying the weight of that bag, running on whatever internal fuel a child burns when the alternative is unthinkable. Ricardo set the phone down and was quiet for a long moment. He thought about what he had expected to find. A toy store, a friend's house, the predictable geography of childish impulsivity. "Pull up the full route," he said to the driver. "Pequannock to the hospital, street level." The driver pulled it up on the navigation screen. Ricardo leaned forward and looked at the blue line tracing the path from the estate's general direction to Bridgeport Hospital's main campus on Grant Street. 3.2 miles, mostly straight, with 2 significant uphill segments near the rail corridor, in the rain, without stopping. He thought about his own life at 10 years old, a 2-room apartment in the Bronx, a father who worked 2 jobs, a neighborhood that required a particular kind of alertness just to move through without incident. He had learned early that the world did not extend mercy simply because you were young and had no other options. That lesson had made him what he was. It had also cost him certain things he had not fully cataloged until now. Teo. He had the phone to his ear again before the thought had fully completed. Is the boy still inside the hospital? Far as I can tell, yes. He went through the main entrance on Grant Street about 40 minutes ago. No footage of him coming out. And the father? Gilberto Iglesias. Is he admitted there currently? A pause. The sound of keys. Cardiac ward? Teo said quietly. On 4th floor. Ricardo ended the call. The Mercedes turned onto Grant Street, and the hospital came into view ahead, its broad glass entrance lit against the gray afternoon, the American flag above the awning moving in the wet wind. Somewhere on the fourth floor, a boy who had run 3 miles in the rain was trying to save his father's life with money that did not belong to him. Ricardo felt the cold logic he governed himself with strain, just slightly, done at its edges. Bridgeport Hospital smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular stillness of a place where people came to wait for news they were not ready for. Ricardo walked through the main entrance on Grant Street without slowing. The automatic doors parted ahead of him, and he moved through them the way he moved through most spaces, as though the room had already made accommodations for his arrival. The Brioni jacket, still immaculate despite the damp October air outside, and I caught the fluorescent light of the lobby in a way that drew the eye and held it. He was not a tall man, not physically imposing in the obvious sense. But there was something in his bearing, the absolute economy of his movement, the absence of uncertainty in each step, that caused people to adjust their behavior around him without being able to say exactly why. The woman at the reception desk looked up. Whatever she had been about to say arranged itself differently once she took him in fully. She offered him a careful professional smile and said nothing. He did not stop at reception. A security guard near the elevator bank straightened slightly as Ricardo passed. A nurse carrying a clipboard paused mid-stride and then resumed walking with the slightly overcorrected pace of someone pretending they hadn't paused. Ricardo noticed all of it in the peripheral way he noticed everything. Catalogued and filed, assigned its proper weight, which in this case was very little. He found the fourth-floor waiting area without asking for directions. He had memorized the hospital's layout from the satellite view on the navigation screen during the drive, a habit so old it no longer registered as deliberate. The cardiac ward's family waiting room was at the end of the east corridor, past a set of double doors with a push plate worn silver from years of hands. He pushed through and stopped just inside the entrance. The room was small, a row of blue upholstered chairs along 2 walls, a low table with magazines that no one had touched, a window overlooking the gray Connecticut afternoon. A vending machine hummed softly in the corner. Jordan sat in the chair nearest the window. He was still in his wet jacket. It had dried unevenly, darker at the shoulders and sleeves, lighter at the center, tracing the map of how the rain had found him. The canvas bag sat on the floor between his feet, handles twisted together, still full. In front of him on the low table was a document of some kind. A form from the look of it, the kind that came with an administrative clipboard and a pen attached by a plastic cord. A nurse must have brought it while he waited. He hadn't filled it in. He was just staring at it. He had not heard Ricardo come in. For a moment, Ricardo simply stood there, one hand resting against the doorframe, and looked at the boy who had outmaneuvered him. The boy who had run 3 miles in October, rain with $100,000 held against his chest, had walked through the doors of this hospital soaking wet and alone, and was now sitting very still with a form he did not know how to complete. Because, Ricardo understood suddenly, he did not know what insurance meant, or how to spell the name of his father's condition, or what to write in the box that asked for an emergency contact. He was 10 years old. Jordan looked up. The expression on his face when he saw Ricardo standing in the doorway was not what Ricardo had expected. It was not panic. It was not defiance. It was relief. And that, more than anything else in the past 3 hours, was what finally stopped Ricardo Alejandro completely. Ricardo sat down. Not across the room, not in the chair nearest the door. The exit position, the power position, the seat a man takes when he wants to remind the room who holds the advantage. He pulled the chair directly beside Jordan, close enough that the boy would have to look up only slightly to meet his eyes, and he sat with his forearms resting on his knees and his hands loosely joined, the way a man sits when he has decided that this particular conversation requires him to be smaller than usual. Jordan watched him do all of this without moving. The vending machine hummed. Somewhere beyond the double doors, a cart rolled down the corridor, its wheels marking the linoleum in a rhythm that faded and disappeared. The late afternoon light through the waiting room window had gone flat and gray, the kind of October sky over coastal Connecticut that carries winter in it before winter has officially arrived. Ricardo looked at the canvas bag between the boy's feet. Then he looked at Jordan. "Tell me," he said. Not an accusation. Not a demand in the way he was capable of making demands. That low, a final register that caused grown men to recalibrate their answers before they had finished thinking them. He said it the way you say it, when you already know the broad shape of the answer, and what you are asking for is the interior. The part that explains what the facts alone cannot. Jordan was quiet for a moment. His hands were in his lap, and he looked down at them the way children look at their hands when they are organizing courage. "My father needs a surgery," he said. "His heart." He paused. "They said it would cost $100,000. The part that insurance won't cover." Another pause, shorter. "I heard my mom on the phone, a lot of times." Ricardo said nothing. "She didn't know I could hear her." Jordan's voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been held still by force for a long time. "She would go into the bathroom and turn the faucet on so I couldn't. But our apartment is small." The faucet detail landed somewhere in Ricardo's chest and stayed there. "I saw the briefcase," Jordan continued. "I saw it was open. And I saw you were asleep." He looked up then, directly, with the brown eyes of a boy who had made a grown man's decision and was not going to pretend otherwise. "I knew it was wrong. I knew what you were. I knew what could happen." A breath. "I took it anyway." Ricardo held the boy's gaze. "Because $100,000 can be replaced." Jordan said it without theatrics, without the trembling drama of a child who had rehearsed the line. He said it the way you say something you worked out for yourself in a cold rain over 3 miles of Connecticut pavement. "My father can't." The room was very quiet. Ricardo looked at the form on the table, the blank fields, the pen on its plastic cord. He thought about a boy sitting alone in this chair, soaking wet, bottled with a bag full of money he couldn't deposit, and a form he didn't know how to fill, and a father 4 floors above him whose chest was failing at 61 years old. He thought about Dorcas at the kitchen window, with a dish in her hand, staring at nothing, running the faucet at midnight so her son couldn't hear her asking strangers over the phone to save her husband's life. He thought about what it cost to maintain the kind of silence this family had been living inside. Slowly, Ricardo reached forward and picked up the pen. He turned the form toward himself. His handwriting was precise and small, the cursive of a man who had been educated by people who believed penmanship reflected character. He filled in the fields that needed filling: the insurance supplemental authorization, the surgical consent reference number, the name and extension of the department administrator he knew, by professional proximity to this city's institutions, for it would answer his call within the hour. He set the pen down. Jordan stared at the completed form. "The money," Ricardo said, "stays with me, but your father gets his surgery." He let that settle. "Do you understand the difference between what I'm offering and what you tried to do?" Jordan looked at him carefully. "You're saying mine was stolen. Yours is a gift." "I'm saying," Ricardo replied, "that how a thing is given matters as much as the thing itself." He held the boy's gaze. "Your father raised someone worth giving it to. That is not nothing." Down the corridor, beyond the double doors, a doctor's voice called a name Ricardo didn't recognize. And Jordan, for the first time since Ricardo had walked into that waiting room, exhaled. Ricardo made one phone call from the hallway outside the waiting room. He kept his voice low, his back to the double doors, one hand in his jacket pocket. The call lasted 4 minutes. By the end of it, to Gilberto Iglesias had been moved to the top of the surgical scheduling list. The financial hold on his case had been administratively resolved, and a patient liaison named Ortega, a serious woman who owed Ricardo a professional courtesy she had been expecting to repay for 2 years, was on her way up from the billing department to ensure that nothing bureaucratic stood between a man and his surgery. Ricardo ended the call, slid the phone into his breast pocket, and stood for a moment in the corridor. The cardiac ward had its own particular sound, the soft percussion of monitors, the measured footsteps of nurses who had learned to move quickly without appearing to hurry, the occasional low exchange of voices behind half-closed doors. It was a sound that reminded you, if you were paying attention, that the body was a temporary arrangement, that all the briefcases and Brioni jackets and mahogany desks in the world were ultimately beside the point. He had not thought about that in some time. He went back into the waiting room. Jordan was in the same chair, but something in him had shifted. The particular quality of stillness had changed from braced to exhausted, the way a person looks when they have been holding themselves together through sheer will and have just been given permission, finally, to stop. The canvas bag was still at his feet. Ricardo looked at it, then pulled his chair back to where it had been, not close, not the deliberate proximity of the conversation just finished, but not across the room either. A middle distance, the distance of two people who have arrived at an understanding and are now simply occupying the same space while it settles. "Your father's surgery will be scheduled within the week," Ricardo said. "You don't need to explain anything to your mother about how, and only that it's been arranged." Jordan looked at him with an expression that was too old for his face and too young for what it had just been through. "She'll ask. Then tell her the truth, that you went looking for help and you found it." Ricardo paused. "That is the truth." The boy considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then quietly, "What do you want from me?" It was a fair question, a smart question. The question of someone who understood, even at 10, that things given without stated terms often carried heavier costs than things with prices clearly marked. Ricardo felt something close to approval move through him. "Nothing that you aren't already capable of," he said. "I want you to finish school, not adequately. Well, I want you to learn what money actually is, which is a tool, not a solution. I want you to understand that what you did today was both the bravest and the most reckless thing you will likely do before the age of 30, and that the difference between bravery and recklessness is usually just outcome." He leaned back slightly. "And I want you to come to the estate on Saturday mornings. There are things I can teach you that school in Bridgeport won't." Jordan was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the gray Connecticut sky had deepened toward evening, the lights of the city beginning to assert themselves against the dusk. Somewhere to the south, across the Sound, so Long Island was a dark suggestion on the water. "Why?" Jordan asked. Ricardo looked at the boy, the wet jacket, the steady gaze, the posture of someone who had walked 3 miles in the rain carrying more weight than his years entitled him to, and had not once put it down. "Because I have spent 40 years building things," Ricardo said, "and I have not spent nearly enough time deciding who should inherit them." He rose from the chair, unhurried, and straightened his jacket with the habitual gesture of a man returning himself to his usual form. "Not the money, the thinking behind it. That is the only thing worth passing on." He picked up the canvas bag from the floor and held it for a moment. The weight of it, the plain practicality of it, a grocery bag that had carried $100,000 3 miles through October rain in the hands of a child who loved his father more than he feared consequences. He set it on the chair beside Jordan. "Keep it," he said. "Call it tuition, for both of us." He walked to the door and then he stopped, because that was the kind of exit he was. the kind that paused just long enough to leave something behind. "Your father is going to be all right, Jordan." He said it without turning around. Then he walked out into the corridor, past the nurses who quieted as he passed, past the elevator bank and the security guard who straightened again from instinct, and out through the automatic doors into the evening air of Bridgeport, where his car was waiting at the curb and the first real cold of the season had finally arrived. He stood outside for a moment before getting in. Above him, somewhere on the 4th floor of that building, a man was being told his surgery had been approved. Somewhere in a house in Connecticut, a woman was still folding linen with trembling hands, not yet knowing that the thing she had been carrying in silence for 14 months had just been lifted. And in a small waiting room with blue upholstered chairs and a humming vending machine, a boy was sitting with a canvas bag in his lap, learning for the first time that power, real power, was not something you took. It was something you chose to give. Ricardo got into the car. "Home," he said. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, when the word felt like it meant something, Ricardo Alejandro walked into that hospital expecting to recover what was taken from him. He walked out having given away something far more valuable, and feeling, for the first time in decades, like a man who had made a genuinely good investment. That is the moral buried inside this story. Power without purpose is just furniture. A man can fill 14 rooms with the finest things money can source. Brioni suits, mahogany desks, briefcases stacked with $100 bills, and still be living in a kind of poverty that no accountant can measure. Ricardo had spent 40 years building an empire and had somehow neglected to build a reason for it. It took a 10-year-old boy, soaking wet, running 3 miles through a Connecticut rain with borrowed money pressed against his chest, to show him what genuine wealth actually looked like. It looked like loyalty. It looked like sacrifice. It looked like a child who understood, without anyone teaching him, that some things in this world are worth every consequence. Jordan didn't steal out of greed. He stole out of love. And when Ricardo finally saw that clearly, when he stopped looking at the missing briefcase and started looking at the boy who had taken it, something in him that had been closed for a very long time quietly opened. The greatest among us are not those who accumulate the most. They are those who recognize what deserves to be protected, and who use whatever they have been given to protect it. That is the new covenant. Not between a mafia boss and a maid's son, between power and its true purpose. If this story moved you the way it moved us in the writing of it, please give it a like. It takes 1 second, and it means everything to a small channel trying to reach the people who need these stories most. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. We have more coming, and they only get better from here.